If you enjoy reading, scary stories to tell in the dark book can be the best option for you. This book contains horror stories for your child's entertainment. Check it out on Amazon. And this is the best-selling book. I will provide the link in the first comment and description box. Check it now and get a 45% discount. I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. I'm almost 60 years old now, and even though I've been fishing thousands of times, I can't think of any other way I'd rather spend the rest of my life. My kids are all off living their own lives, and things around the house are quiet now. You could hear a pin drop most of the time. Sometimes I miss the old days, being able to throw the pigskin around with my boys in the backyard, but some things just aren't in the game plan anymore. I usually fish with my pals from college, but more often than not, I find myself going at it alone, like lone wolf. This was one of those times. I haven't stepped foot outside upstate New York in over 15 years. I don't see a reason to. We've got some of the best fishing lakes in the country, and I plan on making full use of them. It was mid-April, in the early season, just after the ice out and before May hit. For whatever reason, I decided I wanted a more secluded spot this time around, so I chose a nondescript lake in the middle of nowhere that was pretty small. I drove up an hour before sunrise so that I could be out on the water when the sun poked through. I unstrapped my kayak from the roof of the car and made my way over to the lake. I rode out to the middle of the lake and admired the beautiful early colors starting to paint the sky. It felt like home. You can bet your bottom dollar I'd never trade a day like this for anything. It was a little chilly, but I've got skin like steel. I could tell the sun was just about to appear in the sky, so I started gearing up. I was shooting for a largemouth bass, so I made my way back to the outside edge of the weed beds, planning to move back toward the middle of the lake if I got skunked. I went for a 6 1/2 FT medium action spinning rod with 9 pounds monofilament line. I was using a wacky rig, which is a 4-inch rubber stick worm, my go-to for catching largemouth. Just before I was about to start what would hopefully be a swell day on the water, I noticed something strange across the lake. I couldn't quite see what was going on, but I could tell that there was movement. At first, I thought it was a fellow fisherman, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached into my knapsack and pulled out my pair of binoculars I used for birdwatching. I looked across the lake, and there were 3 figures wearing dark colors and hoods covering their faces. They looked like they were digging a hole or something on the edge of the lake. I kept watching. They finished their hole, and while I was expecting them to put something inside it, they actually did the opposite. One of them pulled something out of the hole, which I couldn't make out even with my binoculars. Then the other 2 did the same, pulling out a few more things that I couldn't quite see. I was beyond confused. Then I watched as they started tossing the items into the lake, each one making a distinct splash as it smacked the water. Something was wrong. Out of nowhere, a wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know who these people were, but I started thinking they might be dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, they started to leave without noticing me. I thought about turning a blind eye, but couldn't bring myself to do it. I waited until they disappeared into the woods and slowly rode my way over. I was shaking at this point. I got to the spot where I was pretty sure they had tossed everything. I started fishing, only this time I wasn't fishing for fish. I was going for something else entirely. I fished around for about an hour with no luck. I had to try something different. I racked my brain trying to figure out what I could do, and just then, I remembered my depth checker. I had it tucked away in my Volvo. I was determined at this point. I rode back to shore, returned to my car, retrieved the depth checker, and rode back to the spot. I was sweating heavily at this point. I poked around for a bit, feeling nothing but squishy lake bottom, and then I felt something hard, something metal. I made a mental note of the spot and grabbed my rod. I took the rig off and replaced it. I was a little kid, All the older men in my family would take me fishing every opportunity they got. It was like some family ritual. Being the youngest, meant that I was next in line to become an expert, like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother, Matthew. Our houses were decked out like the ones you've probably seen on fishing shows. I won't go into detail, but if you took a step into my house, you'd instantly be able to tell my parents spend more time on the water than on the land. This is actually his story, not mine. My dad's a pretty hard guy to scare, but let me tell you, whenever he tells the story, it's like he's a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every so often at a family gathering or a special occasion, one of my relatives will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad's name is John. He was fishing with my Uncle Matthew and their close friends Rich, Jeff, and Monty. They had set out early before the sun had even broken the horizon, heading to a remote spot they had all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove-type area that few bothered to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water, everyone sharing stories and jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove surrounded by dense forest. Monty was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was so early in the morning. My dad tells me all the time that Monty is his wild friend, the one who tends to drink a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of an or hitting the water and their own laughter. Oh, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans that they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to wane, and a dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat literally being swallowed by fog. Rich, who was the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept saying that he had never seen fog so thick. That's how unnatural it was. Jeff, the jester of the group, was almost as drunk as Monty, both of whom were seemingly unfazed by the fog that had ensnared them. It was starting to get dark. They had originally thought that they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Rich agreed that Matthew should just try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog probably wouldn't be as dense. Matthew agreed, but even though he was typically the most cautious, he only narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly came to terms with the fact that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad made the point that they'd need to tell their families about the situation, and of course, they had drifted into an area of the cove that had no signal. My dad needed to handle some business at work, so neglecting the problem was not an option. He offered to go ashore in search of a signal, and Rich and Jeff said they'd join him. Matthew would stay back to guard the boat, and an increasingly inebriated Monty. My dad, Jeff, and Rich made their way over to the shore and jumped out of the boat, only getting slightly wet. My dad made a point of snagging the emergency flares in the boat, just in case they got lost and needed to signal Matthew to come find them. The three of them made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by the shine of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends have all done their fair share of camping, so it wasn't like a forest scared them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always made a point of emphasizing how dark yet eerily foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog. Just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere, a series of strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence, first emerging from directly in front of them before encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they were familiar with. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Rich, the most seasoned of the trio when it came to outdoor survival, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, with a note of genuine concern in his voice. As the lights switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood there frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm sure they were all thinking the same thing. The idea that they might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer. Then silence again, and then a guttural scream echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and full of anguish that it rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods towards them. The three men took off back the way they had come, acting on fear and pure instinct. My dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up for a moment. The woods were as clear as day, and the sight that met their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some of them brandished wooden spears, but the light from the flare only lasted a split second. Jeff screamed and almost stumbled, but Rich quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line panting and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Matthew to start the engine, the urgency in their voices leaving no room for question. Matthew complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air, back towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them, just standing motion. There's a nice hidden lake a short walk away from my house in Parsonfield, Maine. I've been going fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's hidden away from any roads or houses. It has perfect privacy, and I would always be the only one out on the lake fishing. In fact, I would leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier than lugging the thing back and forth through my house to the lake anytime I wanted to use it. I would leave it leaning up against this huge tree every time. The kayak is heavy enough to not fall over from a windstorm or anything. I also leave it covered to prevent critters from taking refuge inside. It was a warm summer's evening. I was out on the lake already for about an hour, and I'd caught a few trout already, which I'd thrown into the cooler. It was dusk at this point. The little bit of light left in the sky was disappearing behind the trees. I was going to bring it in soon, and just then I heard sounds from the edge of the lake. I turned and saw someone standing at the edge of the water, tipping a barrel of some kind over, pouring its contents into the lake. It looked to me like they were polluting the lake with something. I took it upon myself to yell out, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me, and then ran into the woods with the contents of the barrel still pouring into the water. I looked more closely at the liquid being poured out into the lake, and it looked like a dark red liquid, though it was dark out, so I can't say with 100% certainty if it was red, but it was very dark. I felt a sense of unease creep up throughout my body. I decided I wanted to leave. I'm a big nature guy though, and seeing people littering or polluting the environment makes me sick. I genuinely couldn't resist shouting something out to that person, but I didn't feel comfortable here any longer. I planned on reporting this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled the kayak back to my usual spot. I took all of my gear off the kayak before pulling it out of the water. As I was putting the cover over the kayak, I heard one single snap of something not far away, like the crunch of something under a person's shoe. I turned and was about to say, "Who's there?" But I decided against it. I finished covering the kayak quicker than I ever had before. I didn't even bother standing it up to lean on the tree this time. I left it on the ground. I picked up my gear and cooler and started quickly walking out of the woods and out to the road which led to my house. It was only a couple minutes of a walk, and I was back home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time though, thinking someone was behind me. I put my gear in the shed real quick, then went inside. I never locked the door so quickly. I was genuinely spooked. I rinsed off the trout and put them in the fridge, planning on cooking them tomorrow. Tonight I just heated up some leftovers. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread that I was feeling the entire walk back to the house returned in an instant, and my suspicion that I was being followed home was basically confirmed. I mean, who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, my car was in the driveway. Whoever it was knew I was in here. I had all the shades closed though, so nobody could look inside. They knocked on the door again. The microwave beeped as the timer hit 0. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it. All the windows were cracked open. And a moment later, there was a knock now on the window, and a man's voice said through the window, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier." I'd just like to explain myself. There was absolutely no chance I was opening the door to this person. For them to stalk me to my house told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling, "Hello," through it. I decided to acknowledge him now that he was getting more aggressive. I yelled, "Yo, leave, or I'll call the police." I intended to either way, but it was still a threat to get him to leave. The man responded calmly now, saying, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. At this point, I shut and locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number detailing both the barrel being dumped into the lake and the man coming to my house. I also made an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection. Honestly, made me feel a little better about going to sleep that night, but thank God I'm a light sleeper. In the middle of the night, like 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I immediately sprang out of my bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard someone's attempt at quiet footsteps coming up the creaky wooden steps. I had my Glock loaded in hand as I stood behind my dresser, right by my closet, aiming at the door. I heard very slow creeping towards my door. My bedroom door is closest to the stairs, so it was naturally the first door that they would approach. And sure enough, I heard the doorknob slowly press down, and then the door pushed open. I saw nothing but the man's silhouette enter the room. I flicked on the lamp next to me so he could see my gun, and I screamed, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands in the air and seemed for a second to be motioning for me to calm down. He had a small blade in his hand. I told him to drop it, but then he said calmly, "I'm leaving," and he turned and ran for downstairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he clearly took the chance on me being too afraid to pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I ran downstairs to lock the front door right away and then call 911. My living room window was shattered. Glass was all over the floor. I kept my sight on that broken window until the police officer showed up. I had to explain that I already made a non-emergency report of what happened earlier in fear of waiting too long by mourning for the barrel to be gone. In the darkness, I went with 2 of the officers who showed up to my house to where I saw that man dumping the barrel into the lake. But after 20 minutes of walking around looking for it, it was gone. The man must have made sure not to leave it behind. I gave my best description of the man to the police for their report. The man was a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room all night with my gun next to me, watching TV. No way in hell was I going. In the heart of the dense pine forest lay 𝐬𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐲, its waters shimmering under the pale moonlight like a mirror to the heavens above. For years, it had been a sanctuary for anglers seeking solace and the thrill of the catch. Among them was Lucas, a seasoned fisherman with a love for the tranquility of the lake. It was a crisp autumn evening when Lucas packed his gear, his breath forming wisps of vapor in the chilly air. With his trusty rod in hand and a tackle box slung over his shoulder, he made his way through the winding trails that led to the lake. The rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds that accompanied him on his journey. As he approached the shore, Lucas felt a sense of anticipation building within him. The water lay still, its surface reflecting the myriad colors of the surrounding foliage. Setting up his fishing spot, Lucas cast his line into the depths below, the bait dancing upon the gentle ripples. Hours passed, and Lucas found himself lost in the rhythm of his craft. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow upon the landscape. But just as he began to relax into the serenity of the night, a strange sensation crept over him. A chill ran down Lucas' spine as he felt eyes watching him from the darkness beyond the treeline. Brushing it off as mere paranoia, he continued to fish, though the feeling of unease lingered at the edge of his consciousness. Suddenly, a tug on his line jolted Lucas from his reverie. With a surge of excitement, he began to reel in his catch, anticipation coursing through his veins. But as the creature emerged from the depths, Lucas's excitement turned to horror. It was like no fish he had ever seen before, its grotesque form twisting and writhing in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly hue, and rows of razor-sharp teeth lined its gaping maw. Frozen in terror, Lucas could only watch as the creature lunged towards him, its jaws snapping shut just inches from his face. With a cry of fear, Lucas stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the creature's deadly bite. Heart pounding in his chest, he scrambled to his feet and fled into the safety of the forest, the creature's unearthly shrieks echoing in his ears. For days, Lucas remained holed up in his cabin, haunted by the memory of that fateful night. He tried to convince himself that it had all been a trick of the mind, a figment of his imagination brought on by the solitude of the lake. But deep down, he knew the truth. The creature from the depths was real, and it hungered for more than just fish. It hungered for him. Determined to confront his fears, Lucas returned to 𝐬𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐲, his resolve as steely as the blade of his knife. With each step he took towards the shore, the memories of that night flooded back with renewed intensity. But he refused to let them hold him back. As he cast his line once more into the murky depths, Lucas felt a sense of defiance rising within him. He would not be cowed by the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. He would face it head-on, armed with nothing but his courage and his determination to survive. But as the hours passed and the moon reached its zenith, Lucas began to feel that familiar sense of unease creeping over him once more. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows dancing in the moonlight like specters from a nightmare. And then, just as before, he felt it. The eyes watching him from the darkness, the sense of impending doom that hung heavy in the air. But this time, Lucas was ready. With a steady hand, he reeled in his line, his senses on high alert for any sign of movement beneath the surface. And then it came, a ripple in the water, barely perceptible against the moonlit backdrop. But Lucas saw it, and he knew what it meant. The creature was back, and this time, there would be no escape. With a primal roar, the creature burst forth from the depths, its hideous form illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. But Lucas was ready, his knife gleaming in the moonlight as he prepared to face his foe. As the creature lunged towards him, Lucas met it head-on, his blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. For minutes that felt like hours, the two adversaries battled beneath the moonlit sky, their grunts and snarls mingling with the rustle of leaves and the gentle lapping of the waves. But in the end, there could only be one victor. With a final, desperate lunge, Lucas drove his knife deep into the creature's heart, its unearthly shrieks filling the night air as it thrashed and writhed in its death throes. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The creature lay still, its lifeless eyes staring blankly up at the sky. And as Lucas stood victorious over his fallen foe, he knew that he had conquered not only the creature from the depths, but also the darkness that had threatened to consume him. For he was Lucas, master of Lake Elysium, and nothing would ever stand in his way again.